Pilot Debrief just broke down his thoughts on the Air India 171 crash, and in this video, I'm going to break down where I think Pilot Debrief made a critical error in his assumption of what happened in the Air India 171 flight. In this video, I'm also going to respond to some of the other comments that we've seen on the Air India 171 flight, though I don't want to rehash a lot of what we've talked about in the past, since we have multiple videos already on the Air India 171 flight. Instead, I'd like to focus on the possibility that the pilot, or one of the pilots, accidentally or inadvertently shut down the remaining functioning engine, or the critical engine in this case, the one left operating, accidentally, instead of shutting down potentially a failed engine.
Certainly possible that at some point during the takeoff, perhaps after V1, they had an engine failure and we just can't see it on the video. Maybe you rotated too early, or maybe you stayed on the ground a little bit longer for the takeoff roll, and now you're distracted by all the warnings going off as you start to rotate away from the ground, so you forget to raise the gear. It's a hot day and you've got a fully loaded 787 on your hands and the aircraft is struggling to climb, and for some reason you rush to shut down the bad engine, but instead one of the pilots reaches down and accidentally moves the fuel control switch for the good engine to the off position. Now you have dual engine failure and you might not even realize what just happened, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Let's discuss this. Keep in mind, my name's Meet Kevin. I am a pilot of a Phenom 300E. It's a dual multi-engine jet aircraft. I am a pilot in command, single pilot rated, and let's get into the analysis. So first, I want to just start with saying I love Pilot Debrief. I actually credit his videos for me getting into aviation in the first place. And generally, he has exceptional analysis and commentary that I typically agree with wholeheartedly. In fact, I love the guy, would love to meet him one day, and I honor what he does on the channel because I think it makes the entire aviation community better. But that's exactly why I want to take issue with the potential that somebody inadvertently shut down one of the engines on a jet aircraft. I believe that this is incredibly unlikely because jet aircrafts are just, well, frankly, very different from multi-engine propeller aircraft. Let's first understand this. Pilot Debrief makes a few comments that I think are very on point. He says that we have poor visual verification that the ram air turbine was actually deployed. And this is true. We really only have good audio confirmation that the ram air turbine was deployed, suggesting some form of critical cascading failure of the electronic engine control systems, the electronics inside the aircraft, as well as potentially the cascade of some form of fail-safe reversion to idle thrust, or potentially some form of really rare dual engine vapor lock with multiple hours on the tarmac, a lack of cabin air conditioning, and a failure of electronic pumps, leaving only suction to potentially prevent engines from failing on a dual vapor lock. Now, that's a lot of information there, and I'm really just catching up to what we've talked about in the past. All of these things individually extremely rare. Do we ever hear of an aircraft crashing because of a single failure? No. In fact, I would argue we almost never hear of any aircraft crashing because of a single failure. It's always a cascade of failures. Planes don't fall out of the air because of vapor lock. We never even talk about vapor lock on jets. We never even talk about hot air temperature takeoffs because it's so routine to take off in the hot air. We only bring these issues up along with some form of potential catastrophic computer failure where the electronic control systems were somehow surged with electricity, leading to some form of massive FADEC failure, because we're looking for some form of answer. How could an aircraft kill over 270 people? That's a modern 787-8 Dreamliner aircraft, the first to actually have a catastrophic accident like this, and one of the worst aviation disasters in decades. Now, it's remarkable, obviously, that one person was a sole survivor, but let's be clear, we don't have the answers yet. However, there are some things that I can take credit with what Pilot Debrief says, and then I have to take issue with the idea that one of the pilots inadvertently shut down the wrong engine. So first, I believe that Pilot Debrief is absolutely correct. So Hoover, I think you're absolutely correct when you say we don't have excellent camera footage of the takeoff or the accident. In fact, in my opinion, I think it would be very wise for airports across the country to have relatively inexpensive pan-tilt zoom PTZ cameras that simply pan over to the airport runway that is currently in use. Obviously, if we have intersecting runways, then have two PTZ cameras at the control tower. I think it would be an inexpensive feature at every airport so we could see aircraft when they are in the most critical phase of flight, takeoff and landing. That, after all, is where the vast majority of aircraft accidents occur. So investing in relatively inexpensive PTZ camera technology would be a fantastic recommendation, though I recognize that these days the government spending more money isn't the most popular thing to encourage. That said, I also take, while I give a lot of credit to Hoover, I do take issue that the ram air turbine was deployed. He suggests that it's not entirely clear whether or not it was deployed. I think based on the audio, it's pretty clear, but let's assume for a moment that it didn't deploy, and we'll get to the conversation on single engine out procedures. That said, I want to give credit to Hoover when he says that it's unlikely that the flaps being misconfigured or accidentally the rare case of a pilot putting up the flaps instead of the gear would have led this aircraft to collapse out of the air. I do not believe solely that would lead this aircraft to crash, and so I give Hoover complete credit for this. Yes, would it be unideal? Absolutely. Could you suffer some increased sink rate at the time? Absolutely. Are you in a max weight takeoff configuration with a hot day, so low lift and potentially misconfiguring the aircraft? Of course. But I agree with Hoover when I say I don't think that was the core issue here. Again, it was likely a cascade of failures, and as Hoover always says, the Swiss cheese just aligning in the most unfortunate way and timing. I also think that he is correct to say that the gear being down is unlikely to be the sole reason an aircraft would crash, given that aircraft regularly fly with gear down all of the time in training. And this is where I'd like to say, as somebody who's gone through single pilot, multi-engine training for a Phenom 300, this is entirely right. We spent a lot of time flying with the gear down in a pattern, conducting single engine operations, single engine approaches, single engine landings. During your check ride, you need to be able to prove that you could do a single engine go around or a bulked landing at 50 feet. So in other words, I've got the gear down, I'm coming to land, I'm 50 feet from the tarmac, basically, from touching the runway to land. And I go full throttle on one engine operating solely, which means I've got to kick that rudder in to keep this aircraft coordinated. As I take off again, gear down, single engine, full throttle on one engine, no throttle on another engine. So again, this idea that the gear being out was something that solely led to this catastrophe, or that somehow this aircraft couldn't climb on one engine. All of these, I think, are stated by folks who haven't actually gone through flying a jet and what it's like to fly a jet on one engine. It's extremely rare for a jet engine to fail. You have about one failure every 1 in 375,000 hours, which is roughly the equivalent of a plane flying for 40 years straight and never landing. Imagine continuously refueling for 40 years. You could fly for 40 years straight without an engine failure. It's incredible how safe jet engines are and how good they are. So to have a catastrophic dual engine failure, I agree, is incredibly rare. And I think this is where Hoover from Pilot Debrief wonders, okay, is it then possible that we had a single engine failure? Now, where I give credit to Hoover as well, is I initially believed that that was unlikely, given that we didn't see the aircraft yaw. In the Phenom 300, while we do have a thrust reserve, we do experience yaw, significant yaw on takeoff, which is essentially as we're taking off, if we lose an engine, we rapidly yaw, or the nose of the plane goes left or right, depending, of course, on which engine failed, because we have asymmetric thrust. So if one engine is pushing, it makes logical sense that the plane is going to turn in the opposite direction. Entirely normal on propeller planes, normal on jet engines, and jet aircraft. That said, Hoover does pull up an excellent portion of the Boeing 787 manual that suggests that the Boeing automatically compensates via rudder input, pedal input, so a pilot can feel the pedal input occurring, and through this rudder input, but also roll input to try to balance the aircraft and coordinate the aircraft in the event of an engine failure. So a pilot would know there was an engine failure, not only through some nominal yaw, but limited yaw. And then, of course, crew alerting system messages. So CAS messages, yellow messages flashing in front of your face, indicating that there's some form of catastrophic issue with one engine after the takeoff. That said, so far, completely agree with Hoover here. This is a fantastic point. The Boeing is clearly equipped with advanced technology that enables limited yaw on a single engine failure.
That once you're above 60 knots on the ground, and also once you get airborne, the system automatically inputs rudder to counter the majority of that yawing moment due to an engine failure, so we might not even notice it in the video.
I give credit to this as well. I think this is an excellent find from Hoover, and I appreciate that. However, where I take issue with Hoover is that he suggests that it's possible pilots may have shut down the wrong engine.
But instead, one of the pilots reaches down and accidentally moves the fuel control switch for the good engine to the off position,
as they were trying to secure the failed engine. So let's say the number one or the left engine failed and the right engine was still functioning. In this case, typically in a propeller aircraft, for example, you would almost be in a rush against the clock to shut down and secure the failed engine. But if you accidentally shut the power or cut the fuel off of the wrong engine, now you have one engine that has failed and one engine that just has been fuel starved, leading to a complete dual engine failure. And now I'd like to explain why I think this is extremely unlikely. First, typically, upon rotation, even if you had an engine failure or engine fire, which we obviously don't see any indication of engine fire, even if you had an engine failure upon rotation, the procedure in a jet engine is very different from that of a propeller aircraft. With a propeller aircraft, you're typically going to go through steps such as pitch for the blue line, which is your minimum control speed with one engine out, or OEI, one engine out, or one engine in-op, we like to say. So you're going to pitch for blue line, and then you're going to identify the failed engine. Typically, what we like to say is dead foot, dead engine. So for example, if my left engine fails, I'm stepping on the right rudder to bring that nose over to the right, and my left foot isn't doing anything, so I'll slap my right leg. Left leg dead, left engine dead, left engine dead. Then we're going to move to verifying. So pitch for blue line, identify, hit the leg, and verify. How do we verify? We pull the throttle back on the left engine. When we pull the throttle back on the left engine, we're not cutting the engine off. We're simply checking, okay, if I pull the throttle back on the left engine, am I losing the rest of my thrust? If I'm losing my thrust, it means I'm pulling back the power on the working engine. If I'm not losing any thrust and nothing changes when I move that throttle back and forth, I mean, realistically just back, obviously I have now verified that that left engine is indeed the failed engine. And now we'll look down at our engine securing procedures such as reducing the mixture, feathering the propeller, more likely feathering the propeller, then reducing the mixture and then cutting the fuel valve off for that particular engine, along with turning off the magnetos or the ignition or whatever, depending on your specific aircraft. Now, why is this really critical in a propeller aircraft? Well, in a propeller aircraft, this is very typical. You sort of rush to secure or shut down the failed engine because of the massive drag that occurs when you have a propeller in the unfeathered position. On screen, you're going to see a picture of an unfeathered propeller. This propeller creates a lot of drag when the wind hits it, and it's by design. It's supposed to be a wing that is able to bite out of the air as you fly to create lift. Now, on screen now, you're going to see an image of an unfeathered propeller, and you can compare that to the, to the feathered propeller. You can compare that to the unfeathered propeller. Now, why is the feathered propeller angled essentially straight into the wind? It's simply to reduce the drag of the dead propeller. So imagine you're driving a car down the road, you stick your hand out of the window. In a car, you feel substantial push against your hand, pushing your hand back. Now imagine that's a propeller that's dead. And in an aircraft, as your hand gets pushed back, rather than your hand necessarily getting pushed back, that propeller is really just dragging that plane towards the dead engine, and it's making it very complicated to control. This is where we like to feather the dead engine or secure it as soon as possible in a propeller plane. And it's solely to reduce the drag on that side of the aircraft. Now, of course, you're still going to have asymmetric thrust, but your thighs aren't going to throb out of your leg because you aren't fighting to control that single engine out aircraft maneuverability, which you really have to put a lot of pressure on. It feels like you're doing lift presses in a gym, with like 100 pounds of pressure, because it's so hard to keep this aircraft controlled with an unfeathered propeller. It is strenuous. So this is why on a propeller plane, it is very common upon an engine failure, pitch for blue line. You can kind of cheat with this by just pitching for the horizon. We're slightly above the horizon, so you're slightly climbing. Typically, we like to pitch for a V2, but as a reaction function, we like to say level the plane and start going down the checklist of securing this engine as soon as possible. Now, why is this different in a multi-engine jet aircraft? Well, it's different because there is no feathering of a jet engine. The jet engine isn't going anywhere. I can't feather the blades of a jet engine turbine. It is impossible for me to reduce the drag of that engine. And when we look at takeoff with engine failure configuration checklists, we do not have any memory items for actually shutting down the aircraft. In fact, here is my manual, which indicates that if we have an engine failure of one engine upon takeoff, we are to continue takeoff, rotating to flight director initial pitch. However, we're going to adjust that pitch to a lower pitch for manually, typically for one engine, and we're going to maintain a V2 speed. We're going to move the landing gear up, then we will identify the affected engine. However, we're not even going to secure it yet. Instead, we are going to engage the autopilot, select the altitude and heading on the flight control system. We're going to retract the flaps on schedule. We are going to move our thrust levers to a continuous and climb setting. We are going to adjust our altitude, our flight level change, and only then, once we have actually configured the aircraft for flight and we are at a level of flight where we are slowly gaining altitude, only then are we actually going to move to completing an engine failure shutdown checklist. In other words, there is zero memory item for an engine failure to shut down the aircraft. In fact, there aren't even memory items for an engine failure on this particular checklist beyond the usual, which is maintain aircraft control. So this is your counter rudder, pitching for a lower bank attitude. Lower attitude, not lower bank. That's confusing. And then maintaining aircraft control. And this is something that Hoover always talks about. He always talks about maintain aircraft control. In fact, he says that when you have a failure in an aircraft, the military used to teach him, you would say, number one, fly the damn plane. Aviate, navigate, communicate. But whatever you do, just fly the damn plane. And so I'm surprised that didn't come up in his discussion here. Now, for an engine fire is going to have a slightly different checklist. An engine fire in flight is going to call for the following. During takeoff, continue the takeoff, rotating to flight director initial pitch, which we adjust to more of a V2 or pitch for the horizon, and then of course adjust to V2. So you're slowly climbing, but you've reduced that pitch. At positive rate, we're going to go gear up, maintain V2, identify affected engine. Mind you, this is literally with the engine on fire. We're still gear up, identify, pitch, set the autopilot, set the the altitude controls, retract the flaps on schedule, and then we're going to set our thrust to continuous and climb, our recall items, affected thrust lever, we are going to go to idle. This is part of our identify the affected engine setting. We're going to make sure we're not shutting off the wrong engine. This is so drilled into us. This is why I think it's so unlikely that the pilots accidentally turned off the wrong engine, because we're going through so many steps. There's really no rush to turn this engine off. And even in an engine fire, it is so important that we verify that engine. And this is drilled into us in either simulator training at like CAE or just frankly in aircraft training. Then, after we go to idle on the affected engine, now we know which engine is affected. Only then would we go to the engine start-stop knob and move it to stop, as well as push in the associated shut-off button. And if after 30 seconds we still have an engine fire, in this case, we would generally deploy our oxygen or our oxygen removing bottle, which is a gas that starves the engine of oxygen, to extinguish any potential fire that's there. Those are our fire extinguishers in the engine. But notice that no matter what checklist you go through, you're typically delaying the shutdown of this engine, even when the darn thing's on fire. It's fly the aircraft first. And this is why I have to say I take real issue with this idea that we're going to rush to shut down the engines. In fact, I responded to one of my coworkers where yesterday he sent me Hoover's video and sort of gave me a quick TLDR. And they wrote, accidentally turning off your one good engine, that would be the worst feeling ever. I wrote, cascade of SH9T is what it was. Many oopsies, which is very common. I personally still think it's likely that the FADEC was, for some reason, through some catastrophic electrical failure leading to the ram air turbine deployment and some form of other either surge in the electrical system or something, these FADECs for some reason responded to a fail-safe thrust zero setting, which is very bizarre. It should not happen, leading to not an engine failure, but rather an engine thrust setting of 0. But I did write, and I feel bad for saying it this aggressively, but I responded to my coworker who wrote, accidentally turning off your one good engine, this seems like the worst thing ever. I wrote, that seems dumb to me. There's zero rush in a jet to turn one off. In prop, there's a rush, but also better be damn sure. And unless those engines were literally melting the side of the aircraft, which in video we could see was not occurring, I don't understand why there is even speculation that the pilots have shut down the wrong engine. It just doesn't make sense to me. Then again, in fairness, we're all anxiously waiting for data on what actually happened here. Now, forgive me, half dressed here, getting ready to go to a wedding. I just wanted to share this perspective as a jet pilot. Hopefully this is useful for you and gives a little bit of perspective from my point of view. And I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm not saying that Hoover is wrong. I'm just saying here are areas where I disagree with Hoover. Mind you, I love the guy, would love to meet him one day. I think he's a great person, great human. I think what he does is one of the most noble things you could possibly do on aviation YouTube, because you are saving lives with the work that you and others in the space are doing. Mentor pilot with what he just pulled off with the FAA flipping on finally their cockpit smoke rules for the 737. These are the work of God. So thank you for doing what y'all do.